Welcome to the Orca. Let's talk gas prices, shall we? Gas prices continue to be a hot topic around BC as constrained supply, high taxes, and onerous regulations conspire to drive up costs. Now, the Premier, John Horgan, has tried to stop the political bleeding over this issue by referring it to the BC Utilities Commission to analyze everything except the provincial government taxes portion and government policy. Now, Blair King is an environmental scientist who works out of Langley and blogs at both his website, a chemist in Langley, and here on the Orca, and we're delighted he joins us via Skype today. Blair, hello.
Hello.
Apart from the weather, we like to talk about the price of gas. And it changes from moment to moment, much like the weather. How do you explain what's going on right now in BC with gas prices?
Well, BC exists in a bigger market where we are price takers and everyone else are price sellers. We are constrained by geography. We are stuck on the west coast of the country where Canadian oil is mostly coming from the center of the country. We have a very limited refining capacity, and almost all our gasoline either comes from Alberta or from the Washington state refineries to our south. As a consequence, we basically are reliant on others, and when you're reliant on others, you end up paying more than if you were able to deal with everything yourself.
I understand, too, BC has what they call the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So the gasoline that we have in our vehicles here is different than the gasoline that they sell in Alberta or even in Washington state across the border. Explain the BC Low Carbon Fuel Standard to us.
Well, as part of our attempt to fight climate change, the British Columbia government decided that we needed low carbon fuel and we needed cleaner burning fuel. They set up a regulation that defines what can go into gasoline in order to meet the carbon out to make our fuel cleaner. And basically what they're adding is ethanol and other additives that have to be specially imported and added to our gasoline. We are BC only. As you mentioned, Alberta doesn't have the same regs, neither do Washington and California. And what this means is that when we get gasoline, we can't just buy gasoline off a tanker and throw it in our vehicles. We have to get it formulated to meet the BC requirements.
So the gas that's refined for us at Cherry Point, let's say in Washington state, is that specifically refined for British Columbia or what?
Well, Cherry Point is a great big refinery that services most of Washington state, some British Columbia, and to some extent Oregon and California. And so they make generic gasoline with no ethanol and no preservatives, and they then ship it to various places. Washington does have a clean fuel standard, and so they have some material that will be ethanol added to it, and when shipped to Canada, that is called motor gasoline. The remainder is material that is shipped to BC. It is then mixed with ethanol that's imported either from the United States or from Alberta, and then distributed to BC. So there's two different. If you're looking at the American statistics, there's two different categories of fuel that come to us, both of which are gasoline.
How does that affect the price of what we pay per liter here in BC then?
Well, if you have, as we know, standardization reduces prices. If we had the same standards as Washington and California, we would be able to buy cheaper gas because we wouldn't have to specialize it. It no longer becomes a boutique material. Because we have to do this addition, there are additives, et cetera, that result in, some people have argued, Dan McTeague says it could be as much as 14 cents a liter extra cost just to make your gasoline from the American standard to British Columbia required.
14 cents a liter.
That's the number that's been the number I've seen bandied around by people who have access to the refinery information is 12 to 14 cents a liter, yes.
That's astounding.
It's a cost of meeting our climate change requirements. It's certainly, if we as a country have decided we want to fight climate change, then we have to acknowledge that there will be costs. And this is one. Now, the question is whether it's a good cost, or useful cost, or whether we could do it in a different way and increase taxes that we could then use to subsidize and to add to innovation, or whether we just pay a whole pile of money to add ethanol to American gasoline.
I want to broaden our scope now, Blair, if you wouldn't mind, and talk about climate change. And I think most Canadians, most British Columbians admit that the climate is overstressed right now. We're all looking for new sources of renewable energy, but realistically, how do we reduce our carbon footprint and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Because you can't do it overnight. And even the electric vehicles people drive require plastic bodies and steel frames. So how do we combat this?
Well, simply put, you're quite right. There are plans in place to get us there in 2030, 2050. Vancouver has an interesting plan that involves getting the city off of natural gas for heating and hot water and getting to electricity. We can certainly work towards getting the automotive fleet, more EVs into the fleet and fewer cars. Fewer internal combustion engines. But realistically, there are a lot of challenges. We don't have mass marketed technology for airplanes, for trains, for transport trucks. Those will still need fossil fuels. And so as a community, we have to come up with the most effective ways of dealing with it. In BC, one of the big ways is we don't use much carbon in our electricity grid. So if we can get everything electrical, and get off gasoline for personal vehicles, that would be a great start. BC is already way ahead of the curve with regards to our electricity, because unlike Alberta or Washington, we just don't have any coal left in our electricity system. So we are about as clean as we're going to get from electricity.
What sort of a commitment would it be on BC if we developed LNG, which right now environmentalists are saying, no more petrochemicals. But this scenario, BC produces the LNG that it ships to China and reduces China's footprint because they can replace coal plants with LNG-fired power plants.
And that's one thing I've argued quite strenuously in the past, is that reasonably speaking, we have to remember that greenhouse gases are global in nature. And the best way we can fight climate change is thinking about it as a global issue. China is right now highly dependent on coal and a material we've probably never heard of called synthetic natural gas, which is natural gas made from coal. And they use that in their electrical system in order to supplement all the renewables that they have. Now, if we can get them off coal and off synthetic natural gas, we can massively decrease the amount of greenhouse gases they produce. It's been said that if we simply supplied natural gas, we could essentially erase the equivalent of half of an oil sands to just through natural gas transition off of coal. If you're getting them off the synthetic natural gas, your numbers are even better. And to explain to your viewers, a synthetic natural gas, basically they take coal and they treat it chemically with heat in order to turn the coal into natural gas, which they then burn. And the reason they do that is because coal plants give off a lot of secondary chemicals and compounds and can be very bad for air quality. And so they've decided it's better to use this high carbon synthetic natural gas than using coal in their facilities in Beijing and other places where they have really bad air quality. And they're willing to sacrifice the carbon in order to get the better air quality and therefore improve the quality of life for their people.
Blair, what are some of the other things we're missing that we could be doing right now to help not just our country, but as you say, the planet?
Well, as I said, getting China off synthetic natural gas, getting ourselves BC is a location of innovation. We have the Ballards, we have the Westports. We should be getting our trucks off of diesel and onto natural gas. We have battery technologies. We have in the interior of British Columbia huge amounts of rare earth metals, which we choose not to mine and we choose not to refine. And so we're dependent on all those batteries and all those technologies that are dependent on rare earths. We have to import those from China because we don't produce them in BC. and we don't produce them in Canada. BC has the potential to be an innovator and a creator of technologies and a supplier for the world when it comes to green technologies.
Blair, fascinating topic. I'm sure we'll chat again about this in the future. I want to thank you for joining us today on the Orca.
And thank you for having me.